welcome back everybody. We're here with Kate Wood from HSBC. Now we've been talking about DE&I and the way that HSBC kind of frames these things, the roles, the services, etc. I'm curious, I want to go back to the internal perspective within the organization. You mentioned, and it seems to be increasingly true, that organizations are collecting a lot of information internally about their staff, about their teams, etc. I'm just curious to know a little bit more about that, and maybe trying to understand, why that's being done and where you see the benefits of that kind of moving forward.
Yeah, definitely. Collecting diversity data, demographic data, or some industries call it self-ID, is a really helpful mechanism to better understand your workforce. And by collecting that data, you can understand where perhaps underrepresented groups are not being fairly progressed, promoted within the organisation, and you can make changes. So at HSBC, we've been collecting this data for some time in the US, in the UK, and more recently we've started to publish it online, gender representation across many of our markets, and then more recently ethnicity as well.
So, okay, I'm sure some of that is voluntary. Maybe it's even something that you see as like a business opportunity, a way to kind of strengthen internal operations. I also imagine that some of that is being pushed externally, maybe through new regulation and stuff. Can you talk about the balance between those two things and where you see this headed?
Yeah, absolutely. Demographic data is all voluntary, but we do see regulations around things like pay gap disclosures in markets like Australia and the UK. So by proactively collecting and publishing additional data, we're staying ahead of perhaps regulations that are coming in the future, knowing that it might be difficult to get employees to disclose this data if they don't understand why it's important, or perhaps they don't have a trust in the organisation that they won't be treated differently because of disclosing things like neurodivergence, sexual orientation, etc.
Okay, so I think these conversations are healthy, very necessary, and I can actually see a lot of ways where they would benefit organizations greatly, but let's just take my personal demographic, white, American, male. I can imagine that there are certain people, especially maybe people that look like me, that would view this as a little bit threatening. And I'm just curious, or maybe even not threatening, but unnecessary. I'm just curious about like how those conversations go on internally. If you get pushback, what does it feel like? And again, if we're talking about people in the workforce, maybe especially men who maybe are seeing some or perceived shift of power or something, how do you have conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion, allyship, their role in creating more inclusive workforce, et cetera? I mean, it's a very complicated thing these days, I think.
I think even the way you framed the question was perfect in acknowledging the unconscious bias that you might have through some of those characteristics, and the piece around allyship is so important. In Hong Kong, there's an organisation called the Women's Foundation, which has a programme called the Male Allies, and they run programmes across the year that touch upon so many elements that you mentioned. And a really interesting one is the zero-sum game, and that concept that just because a woman gets promoted doesn't mean that a man's going to be disadvantaged. So it's really important to have these conversations in the workplace and to lead with curiosity and questions, because we're all learning, and so asking questions, listening, being an active ally is actually going to make the workplace a better place. Yeah.
So if you can indulge just two very quick anecdotes. I remember around the time when the Me Too movement was really taking hold in the US, and Harvey Weinstein and all those terrible cases were coming forward. A lot of organizations, including a lot of banks here in Hong Kong, they were proactively trying to get ahead of this, and they were having conversations about what is appropriate conduct, contact, communication in the workplace, et cetera. And I remember being the same place I was every Saturday morning on the football pitch, watching my kids play soccer or football. And I was speaking to another man that I'd become friends with through that interaction. And he worked in finance, and he said, he was kind of joking, but I think very serious, about how he didn't know what was even appropriate for him to say in the workplace anymore. And I did sympathize, or at least try to empathize with him. But I remember thinking to myself, during that whole era, I just didn't understand that conversation, because I was like, I don't think it requires a lot of instruction to know what is appropriate and inappropriate. But acknowledging that for some people it did. I think just in the past 6 or 7 years, since that really took hold, I think there's been a wild difference in a very positive way, significant shift. And I think people very naturally understood what ground, what jokes, what contact and stuff was appropriate and what wasn't. And certainly there's a long way to go. But I think I've been a little bit surprised, amazed, and impressed with how quickly a lot of that changed. I think the other thing that I wanted to point out is, so for those that the participants, they may know that I was actually one of the original professors in a program called the Women's Directorship Program, and it's a very I think intuitive action over a decade ago by a group here in Hong Kong. They ended up trying to recruit talent for women to be board members and the boards of listed companies. In the region here, female representation was woefully inadequate, very, very low, and barely double digits. And so they, I think very proactively, they identified this problem, worked together with us at the University of Hong Kong, and now for I think 12 years, through 12 programs now, we've worked with hundreds of women, and it's been very, very, again, interesting to see. At first, the idea was, I mean, I was very supportive of this, obviously, because, I was one of the people who originally created curriculum to kind of like help them in this space. But the reality was I was not super hopeful, to be perfectly frank. And I think although there's still a very long way to go, I think it's really remarkable to see how quickly things have shifted in that space as well. And again, that's again very different. I think sometimes it's easier to move things at the margins, like the bottom in the workforce and at the very, very top in terms of senior management or the board. I think there's a lot of work to be done in the middle. But again, I don't know if you have any thoughts on those particular anecdotes, but I think I view a lot of what is happening even with the pushback in a very optimistic sense. And so I'm just curious, like, as someone who does this every day, is it something that you feel is actually working, is changing, or is it something where you just feel like you're Sisyphus, like pushing that rock up the hill every single day?
No, I definitely think it's changing. And to go to your first anecdote, I think that concept of allyship and upstanding interventions is really important and something that we're learning on, but I've seen change so much. So if you are in a conversation or you notice something where you think somebody's perhaps treated unfairly or put at a disadvantage, how do you address that? Is it an immediate intervention, or is it through storytelling, just as you did, or reflective conversation? And actually those latter two can have such a powerful change in the environment that we operate in. So thinking back to that conversation you had in the football pitch, and then how you've perhaps told that story later as well, will have addressed people's experiences too.
Yeah. Okay, so not to put you on the spot again, but I'm just curious, is the goal of someone in the DE&I space to work yourself out of a job? Or do you feel like this is something that good companies will be doing forever?
I think it will continue to evolve. So I don't think it will be called diversity, equity and inclusion in a few years. So whether it sits within ESG, or we touched upon it earlier, but many organisations are adding the B, belonging, a feeling which is a result of the DE and the I. I think it's going to be a big generational shift as well. So obviously the younger generations, they want different things from the workplace. So actually for them, the benefits, the culture, that's what's important to them over salary. So with those younger generations, more demands are going to come, and then the industry will continue to change as well with that.
Yeah, while we're on that, just to make sure that we cover this properly, what as these acronym shifts, and this is something we bring up constantly in this course, the acronym for ESG is likely going to change. DE&I, there's so many acronyms, that is very likely to change. But we think from a course content perspective, we think that these are concepts that are kind of foundational pillars for good, sustainable, profitable businesses over the long run. So we are also, we believe and are optimistic that these things are going to continue to be of importance, even if we describe them differently. But I just want to come back to maybe that shift in acronym and the inclusion of the B, the belonging. Maybe give us some examples of what that what that really means, what that looks like in practice. And I just want to push back a little bit because although I work with youth and I can agree, they are looking at things differently and they want things differently. A lot of the folks that I talk to are my age, right? They're middle to late 40s. And I can tell you, like, concept of belonging is definitely not just a young person thing. Like, people really want to feel not only that their life has a sense of purpose and their work is connected to that purpose, but that they're working with people that they can relate to, that an organization they really feel like they belong to. So what does that look like in practice?
Yeah, there's some great EY research on this, as I mentioned earlier, called the Belonging Barometer, where they surveyed people on what belonging looks like at work. And they found that I think almost 80% of participants said that they felt the highest levels of belonging in life at work, second only to home. So, somewhere you spend a lot of your time, if you don't feel that level of belonging, then those feelings of exclusion and not feeling psychologically safe are going to impact your output. So it comes back to that business case.
Yeah.
But belonging isn't something that you can directly control, right? It's seeing a visibly diverse workforce, but then knowing that it's well managed. A lot of research also shows that a badly managed diverse workforce actually performs worse than a well-managed homogenous workforce.
Okay.
So you have to have that diversity, but it has to be well-led and well-managed as well.
Yeah.
So I think the terminology, some organisations are still just using diversity and inclusion. Some are using equality rather than equity. Some are adding the B, and it'll continue to evolve.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I guess, from a belonging standpoint, I think one of the things that I teach in a lot of my training, because I teach business ethics and a lot about community service and NGO board leadership and whatnot. And, I'm a big believer in the research that's come out recently showing in terms of like what leads people to live long and happy lives. And I absolutely believe, and I think the research shows this as well, that having a sense of belonging, having a sense of community, and then ideally a connection to service in that community really help people live long and happy lives. So if you're looking for ways for your workforce to really feel like they belong, to feel like they're included, and therefore to work harder, smarter, and then to retain that talent, then I think this is something that hopefully we're all taking very seriously.